Hi everyone. In this lecture, we'll talk about monetary and incentive systems. So, according to McGregor's dichotomy of motivation, this was the main theory that was provided in our text. Motivation can be explained by two dichotomies, or two differing theories, theory X and theory Y. So this is part of McGregor's work. So according to theory X, which is the first theory according to McGregor, humans are lazy and they are averse to work. And because they are averse to work, they must be forced and controlled, and provided utility or provided motivation so that they can work. And also according to McGregor in his dichotomy, humans are avoid responsibility. Okay, this is in contrast with theory Y, where working is as natural as resting for people. Okay, and they can lead and control themselves and may even desire responsibility. Okay, according to McGregor, this is a dichotomy because they are motivated by different things. Okay, according to theory X, this is actually in line with the agency theory of motivation. And theory Y, okay, is aligned with the self-determination theory of motivation that we have discussed before. So parang sinasabi ni McGregor, hindi pa ito settled debate, on what motivates people. Is it money or additional wealth or the ability to determine their own future, which is the self-determination theory. So as you know, this is an economic explanation. Theory X is an economic explanation. Theory Y is a psychological explanation or explanation according to psychology. The problem with this is if there are different aspects which incentivizes people and we don't know which ones are correct, how do we then design incentive systems, right? How do you then motivate them? So the answer is you motivate them through both theories. Okay? Because we don't know which one is more important, so gawin na lang natin pareho. Gamitin na lang natin pareho. So in this lesson, in this lecture, we'll talk about incentive systems. How do we incentivize people to perform? No? And that's what we are trying to do in this lecture. Okay? Let's talk about agency theory, which is theory X. Okay? So related to theory X, that's the agency theory. And just as a review, for agency theory, there is a principle. Through a contract, it contracts an agent. Right? Yan yung essentially agency theory. Okay? And the agency conflict or the principal agent conflict stems from the fact na kung ano yung pinagawa ng principal with respect to contract, not necessarily gagawin. No? Not necessarily gagawin ng agent. And the agent must be incentivized para yung actions ng agent is according to the wishes of the principal. Okay? And usually we define that through contracts and through other ways to align objectives. And one way to align objectives is through monetary incentives. Okay? Anong classic niyan? For example, you are the principal, may lupa ka, you contract an agent to sell your land. Okay? Now, your agent, kung fixed lang ang compensation ng agent, right? Hindi ang objective niya, basta mabenta kahit anong presyo, right? Kasi fixed lang yung kanyang compensation. So ang objective niya dahil fixed lang, basta mabenta kahit anong presyo. Right? But if you fix the monetary incentive system, for example, your agent compensation as an agent or as a broker is as a percentage of the selling price. Then your agent The objective now of your agent is not just to sell the property, but to sell it at the highest price possible. Right? And so therefore, aligned na si principal and agent. Okay? Through a set of monetary incentives. Okay? Then the agent's objective is now aligned with the objectives of the principal, which is to sell the property at the highest price possible. Okay? That's how incentive comes into play under agency theory. Okay? So essentially, that's what we're talking about. Under the self-determination theory, okay, it's rooted in psychology, and all agents act in their own self-interest and are motivated by their ability to determine their own future. Self-determination yan. Okay? Now, principals are only interested in financial returns, but agents are not necessarily interested in financial returns. But their ability to influence people, for example, or to have kinship, to have friends, no, to have a smooth working relationship. Those are all part of motivation with respect to the self-determination theory. So money does not necessarily contribute to that, or monetary incentives. Okay. Now let's discuss the roles of compensation in an organization. So obviously, the one major role of compensation is to pay for services, right? Kasi required yan sa batas. I mean, there's no involuntary involuntary services. No, it has to be paid. Okay. So one role of compensation is to provide pay for services received by the organization. Second role of compensation is to attract managers and employees. It's a way to market. No, because the job market is competitive, and if you want the best people, you also need to pay them well. So if you want to attract the best people, you have to pay well. No, or the compensation structure must be designed in such a way that you're able to attract the kind of managers and employees that you desire in an organization. Of course, compensation is also there, is also there with respect to keeping managers and employees or retention. No, pwedeng mataas nga yung initial pay pero walang increase, right? So you're able to attract but you're not able to keep them because there's no increase in pay. Credit for a job well done in terms of bonuses, right? So, okay, magandang performance mo, this is additional pay or additional compensation. It also encourages effort. For example, there are some industries where a significant part of the compensation structure is pay for performance. Okay? Kung nakabenta ka, then meron kang additional pay. Okay? So usually, mga sales agents, ganyan. No? There's a significant variable pay, which is designed to encourage more effort. And additional pay is linked to performance. Incentives can make people more inspired in an organization, of course. Of course, goal congruence, which we'll focus later. And flexible remuneration is to design compensation with fixed and variable pay. We'll discuss more of that later. Okay. So that's the role of compensation in an organization. Of course, the first three are the usual ones that's used as reason. But the next three, credit for a job well done, encourages effort, incentives to make people more inspired, goal congruence, those are all related to management control, right? Because if you provide the proper incentive systems, yung performance measurement that we discussed should be linked to proper incentives, so that those incentives continue to inspire your employees to do well. Okay. What are some types of incentives? So number one, obviously the basic salary is an incentive or a motivator. Okay, so a good salary may make employees feel appreciated and valued. And of course, the pay structure influences the motivations of an organization. If your pay structure is fixed, iba ang impact sa empleyado kaysa variable ito. Okay. Now, there could be short-term variable financial incentives such as bonus schemes. Okay, so the bonus structure can also influence the motivation of employees. Another type of incentives are stock options. You know this already since you're accounting student. So it's a right to buy a number of shares at or after a given date in the future at a price agreed upon at the time the option is granted. If you give stock options to these employees, then iisipin nila na, dapat tumataas ang EPS, Right? Kasi pag tumataas ang EPS, tumataas rin ang value ng aking stock option or ng aking stock ownership. Dapat concerned ako with respect to stock prices, right? And so therefore, because if stock prices are nice or going up, then the value of my stock options are increasing, the value of my stock ownership is also increasing. By making them owners also of the company, then align ng objectives between shareholders and employees. Okay? There are also intrinsic incentives or parang hindi siya incentives na monetary in nature, but aspects related to employee satisfaction. So for example, if you do well, you're given interesting work tasks, you're given tasks that you want, no? If you do well, we give you a challenging work that will enable you to shine more in the organization. That could be an intrinsic incentives. If you do well, we can give you more meaningful work that is important to you, right? And if you do well, there's also camaraderie within your organization or kinship. And that's important also. And that can be motivators. No? So hindi lang pera or options ang motivator, but the work environment or aspects that improve employee satisfaction are also good motivators. Okay. So with respect to agency theory and the design of incentives, the problem is, okay, principals and agents have different objectives. Okay. So principal, agent, they have divergent objectives. So for agents, individuals act in their own self-interest. Okay? So, yung agent, iba-iba yung self-interest nila. Agent meaning employees or managers in an organization. Marami sila eh. Right? And each one have their own self-interest and different ways of making them happy. Okay? Some agent, for example, may averse work. They have preference over leisure over work, or they have work aversion. Some agents might deliberately withhold the effort. We call that shirking from work. Okay. Some agents might be, or some employees might be innately motivated because of the nature of the industry where they are working in. Right? So individuals have different self-interests. Kaya mahirap mag-design ng incentive system for everyone because people will have different interests. Okay? However, principals have only one, principals meaning shareholders, okay, have only one objective, which is financial returns. Right? Wala tayong, ang shareholders, hindi naman naka-affect sa kanila kung averse ba sila sa work, they like leisure over effort. At the end of the day, shareholders want financial returns. So, kaya mahirap mag-design ng incentives kasi at the end of the day, ang principal, financial returns ang kailangan. However, the agents or the employees have different interests. So how do you align them? No? And design an incentive system that will allow them all to care about financial returns. So that's why it's difficult to design incentive systems because of divergent objectives. Another reason why it's difficult to design incentive systems is because of divergent risk preferences. Okay, so in agency theory, it is assumed that managers prefer more wealth to less and that marginal utility decreases as more wealth is accumulated. No? So agency theory, galing sa economics yan. In under economics, okay, if a manager is able to amass more wealth, it increases the happiness of that manager, right? However, the incremental utility decreases as more wealth is accumulated. Diminishing marginal utility is how we usually look at it, right? Now, for managers, their wealth is tied to the firm. Okay, why? Why is their wealth tied to the firm? Kasi kung malugi yung kumpanya, wala na silang pangsweldo. Right? Hindi na sila masusweldohan, mawawalan sila ng trabaho. So managers are usually more risk averse than stockholders. Okay? Kasi a large proportion of their wealth is tied to the firm. Hindi naman sila mayaman eh. Sila ay empleyado lang rin. At a huge part of their income is from the compensation that they get from the company. And so their actions will likely be more risk averse. They want to protect the company more because their wealth is tied to the firm. Now, stockholders, on the other hand, are more risk neutral. Why? Because, except of course, if you're the majority shareholder. If you're for example, nag-invest ka sa stock exchange, you're actually risk neutral because you know that the stock is held by many owners, your risk is diversified, etc. You're able to diversify your risk, so owners will likely be more risk neutral than risk averse, or less risk averse at least than a manager. And because of divergent risk preferences, it's also difficult to align incentive structures. Okay. Another issue with respect to design of incentives, okay, is non-observability of agents' actions. There's information asymmetry between the principal and the agent. Okay. The principal cannot easily monitor the agent's actions. Bakit? The principal is the shareholder. Is the shareholder in the office every day? No. Can shareholders look into the details of the operations? No. Right? They have rights to inspect books, but they cannot position themselves in the office and look at each document. Right? So principals do not necessarily have the power to look into the agent's actions. Okay, so the principal cannot be certain how the agent's effort contributed to actual company results because of information asymmetry. Okay, there's information asymmetry because the agent has more private information. Alam niya yung detalye ng operations, right? And there could be diverging preferences between the principal and the agent may lead the agent to misrepresent information or moral hazard. Okay, for example, earnings management. That's usual naman na moral hazard, right? If your management, meron kang stockholding, or meron kang shares in the company that you're managing. Ibig sabihin, gusto mo ring tumaas yung share price. Kasi pag tumaas ang share price, tataas yung value of your wealth. Okay? What's one moral hazard for you? You can misrepresent net income. No, you can cook the books and increase net income so that it will increase share prices. Right? And that increase in share prices will increase the wealth of management and the shareholders. Right? However, the shareholders are not privy to that information, not necessarily privy to that information. Kasi managers or management has private information on that. Okay? So, therefore, mukhang aligned pero actually hindi because yung preferences nila magkaiba. Okay? Now, there are two ways of dealing with divergent objectives and information asymmetry. First is monitoring, and second is incentive contracting. So monitoring, so the principal can design a system that monitors the agent's actions, limiting actions that benefit the agent at the expense of the principal. So for example, internal control, auditing requirements, etc. Okay, but it's very difficult to monitor complex tasks or decisions that are not easier to understand than usual. Okay. Another way is incentive contracting, which is essentially forming an incentive system. Okay. So principal may attempt to limit divergent preferences by establishing appropriate incentive contacts. Should make the agent work in the principal's best interest because that's what goal congruence is. Okay. So while the two can be done, monitoring and incentive contracting can never ensure complete goal congruence because hindi naman perfect ang mga yan. So meron pa ring agency costs related to these two. What are some problems with CEO compensation and stock ownership plans? Okay. So the risk-averse agent incurs additional risks when pay is based on stock price performance. Obviously, an agent like the CEO or management, okay, when their pay is based on stock price performance, hindi mas risky yung pay or compensation ng CEO. Okay? To compensate for that additional risk, usually nilalakihan yung expected pay. Right? Kunyari ikaw yung CEO and you know that 50% of your pay will be based on stock price performance. Okay. How will you happy ka ba dun? Siyempre hindi kasi meron kang more risks involved. Okay. And because of that additional risk, you will insist on a higher base pay. Right? So that I can be compensated, for this additional risk taking that I am taking as the CEO, I should be compensated more. And because of that, that's additional agency cost, right? Gagastos ka ng additional peso or additional monetary compensation para lang mag-accept siya ng stock ownership, um, or at least compensation that's based on stock price performance. Okay. Lack of direct causal relationship between the agent's effort and the change in stock price is problematic, and therefore the CEO in this case or management may require higher compensation that's monetary. So that's a form of agency cost. Okay. Another is problems with responsibility center management and accounting-based incentives. So usually, as we mentioned kanina or in another video, investment centers can be measured based on accounting-based incentives. But the problem is the responsibility center's effort may not be commensurate or might not be able to influence those accounting-based objectives. Okay, and because of that, there could be agency costs related to it. Okay, because bonuses are not necessarily based on what you can influence, but could be affected by other external factors such as macroeconomic, competition, and demand. Okay, that's why agency theory is important. And according to a study by Jensen in 1990, yung CEO incentive systems and CEO compensation systems should not simply be basta may stock options pwede na or basta may bonuses pwede na. Okay. According to Jensen in 1990, for CEO incentive systems to be effective, it should do these three things. Number one, CEO should be substantial owners of stocks in the company. Kung token lang yung amount of stocks na ino-own niya, right? Maliit lang relative to his total compensation package. Okay? Hindi daw effective ang mga stock ownership na compensation systems. Okay, number two, CEO salaries, bonuses, and stock options should be designed to provide big rewards for superior performance and big penalties for poor performance. Okay? Dapat nararamdaman niya yung impact ng good and bad performance. So it should be big rewards for superior performance and big penalties for poor performance. Okay? For this to be effective in aligning agency theory or aligning the principal-agent conflict. Okay? And third, CEO should be dismissed for bad performance more often. Okay? So dapat their job is on the line, right? If they are not performing well. So according to Jensen, these are what's lacking in CEO incentive systems. And therefore, if you implement this, the chances of aligning principal agent theory is, or fixing the principal agent conflict is higher. Okay. What are some critiques with respect to agency theory? Basically, the assumptions are wrong. Okay, that people do not always make rational decisions and people do not always act out of self-interest. That's something we learned in our human behavior lectures, right? And it usually does not promote ethical behavior such as earnings management because there are moral hazards in place. Okay. On the part of self-determination theory and how does it relate to incentives, we need to understand the interplay between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivations are rewards. Okay, so for example, extrinsic motivation is related to everything a person gains from carrying out a certain task. Extrinsic meaning galing sa labas. Pag natapos mo ito, ito ang reward mo. That's extrinsic motivation. So essentially, yung mga compensation that we've been talking about, those are all extrinsic motivation. Okay. Self-determination theory deals with intrinsic motivation, concerns the satisfaction of carrying out a certain task and reaching that goal. How satisfied are you when you finish a certain task or reach a certain goal? That's what intrinsic motivation is. And that's what you want to harness under the self-determination theory and incentives. Okay? So, we shift perspectives. No, extrinsic motivation, yan yung compensation component. Okay? Intrinsic motivation is employee satisfaction. So, employee satisfaction is a form of incentive. So that's something that you have to understand when it comes to incentive systems in management control. Okay. One issue with respect to the mix between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation is what's called the crowding out effect. Okay. So to be able to explain the crowding out effect, total motivation is the sum of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So how motivated a person is depends on intrinsic motivation, employee satisfaction, plus extrinsic motivation, which is the reward. Okay. However, increasing one type might reduce the other because they are not necessarily aligned with each other. Okay. So extrinsic motivation tends to crowd out intrinsic motivation. No? Adding external rewards might even reduce total motivation. Diba? If you ask your elder siblings, for example, sometimes being rewarded in an organization is actually an additional nail in your coffin sa work. Okay? So I have a story, for example. In my first work, I was given an award after 3 months of being in the company. I did excellent work in a certain activity, right? And after 3 months, I did very well. I was very known in the organization for doing well, and I was given an award, okay, a general manager's award, for example. Okay, because of that reward, of course, I was happy. That was an extrinsic motivation for me, right? But what happened after that external reward? They added so many tasks to me because I was so good, right? Ang galing ko raw eh, o dagdagan ba ang trabaho? Okay. What happened is it reduced my total motivation because my intrinsic motivation decreased. Okay? Right? So ngayon, hindi na ako masaya sa trabaho kasi ang dami ko ng trabaho. I'm not excelling anymore. I'm not satisfied already as an employee. So in that case, the additional external reward, okay, crowded out an intrinsic motivation, which is how inspired am I to work. Okay? That may happen, right? At the same time, a reduction in extrinsic motivation might decrease intrinsic motivation. Pag walang bonus this year, ano ang masatisfied ka ba as an employee or not? Some pwedeng satisfied pa rin. May iba pwedeng dissatisfied na or malungkot na. No? So, they are related, but the impact is not necessarily constant or predictable. Okay? When does the crowding out effect appear? Number one, when there is already a strong internal motivation in place. Mas madaling ma-demotivate with extrinsic motivation, no? When solid na yung employee satisfaction. Kasi mas madaling pag solid na yung internal satisfaction, okay, changes in extrinsic might be demotivating you also. Kumbaga, you have more to lose if you're already satisfied internally. Okay. When the external intervention is perceived as controlling, okay, binibigyan tayo ng bonus because they want us to do more work, or because they don't want us, or tinaasan ang sweldo nating lahat pero tinanggal yung 8-hour a week na 8-hour a day na limit. Wala nang OT pay. So, controlling. So it demotivates me even though it increases my total salary. If on the other hand, the external intervention is perceived as supportive, internal motivation is crowded in. Okay? So for example, there's an additional pay with respect to Wi-Fi sa work from home. Right? That's an external motivation. Right? Additional pay kasi work from home na kasi kayo eh. Kailangan magbayad ng internet subscription. No? So it might crowd in motivation kasi ibig sabihin, nagki-care pala yung aking mga boss sa akin. Right? It makes you more satisfied with work. External rewards do not crowd out motivation if they are unexpected or unrelated to behavior. Windfall, for example. No? And a collective reward is less likely to crowd out intrinsic motivation kasi lahat tayo nag-benefit. Okay? Then happy tayo lahat, then it makes the organization stronger. What are some reasons for the crowding out effect? No? Number one is impaired self-determination. Sabihin, hindi buo yung self-determination, hindi buo yung employee satisfaction. Okay? Impaired self-esteem. Imposing external rewards implies that a person's own involvement and motivation is not enough, thus reducing internal motivation. Okay, so that's also one reason for the crowding out effect. Okay. What are some critiques with respect to self-determination theory? Okay, usually the basic critiques in terms of intrinsic motivation being more effective than extrinsic motivation is that it's usually not in line with the experience of managers. If you talk about managers so organizations, they will still imply that bonuses motivate better than intrinsic motivation, right? Or intrinsic incentives. Okay. And usually the findings from experiments are not relevant in practice. So results of academic studies pushing for self-determination theories are usually clinical and not necessarily practical. So that's why if you look at incentive systems now, bonuses talaga yung main mechanism, no, for incentive systems. It really is. And stock options, compensation, it really is the main tool being used now. But don't discount the fact that employee satisfaction is a significant component of incentives in an organization. I think that's very critical that that portion is still considered in the design of management control systems. Okay. All right, that's the end of the lecture. Thank you.